Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so the record is going, and we can get down to business.
Oh, I don't need my glasses.
Well, when I say business, it's Chol HaMoed Pesach. It's the intermediate days of the holiday of Passover. And this coming Shabbat, we will be reading another special selection for Pesach, because it's the last day of Pesach, well, the 8th day in this particular Shabbat, which means we have a little more freedom to explore something a little bit different. And there is another text that is associated with Pesach that we have not done much study of.
I'm not saying I wait.
Okay.
Whether or not it was that.
You just suddenly looked very, very eager.
We were talking about this before.
Ah,
That you were going to surprise us because of the intermediate day of Pesach.
exactly. So during the time of Pesach, it is customary to read from one of the other Megillas, one of the other Megillot. Now, we've got 5 Megillot that are called Megillot, that are from the section of the Tanakh known as Ketuvim, known as writings. And we read most famously the Megillat Esther, the book of Esther for Purim. But what are the other ones? Right. So
You have to read Song of Songs.
Esther is for Purim.
Ruth?
Ruth is for
Song, right? Ruth,
Kohelet, Ecclesiastes.
Shavuot. I'm going to write Kohelet because it's a lot easier than writing.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
When is Kohelet read?
Sukkot.
Sukkot. We've only got 4.
Proverbs? Is it Proverbs?
Proverbs is not one of the Megillot.
No, wait.
And
What's in the rest of Lamentations?
Lamentations,
Oh, yeah.
also known as Eicha,
Thank you.
which is also shorter to write than Lamentations, which we read on Tisha B'Av, right, for the day of destruction. But our Song of Songs, our Shir HaShirim,
It's better.
Pesach.
Yeah.
And it is kind of the odd one out. If you read through these other books, it's really obvious why we're reading them on the other topic, except for maybe Kohelet, we'll come back to in a second. So Esther, it's the story of Purim.
Right.
Duh, right? Eicha, it is the lament of the destruction of the first temple of Jerusalem. Of course, we're going to read that on Tisha B'Av. Ruth doesn't mention Shavuot by name, but it is definitely set during the same time of the year, during that harvest season, which Shavuot hits most is most pronounced at. Kohelet, the idea of the vanity of vanities, everything is pointless. That actually fits in very nicely as a bit of an antidote to the over-rejoicing of Sukkot, when everything is in abundance and we're feeling so well and satiated. Kohelet comes along and says, yeah, but you're all going to die, which may sound like a buzzkill, but I like to call it putting things in perspective. So it does play, I think, a very good role there. But Song of Songs, Pesach doesn't talk about the Exodus at all. It doesn't talk about our liberation from slavery at all. In fact, it doesn't talk about the people of Israel as a nation and their history or anything at all. So what's the association?
It's about the fresh. Solomon wrote it when he was young. It was the first.
It's about love.
It's about freshness. It's about something new and creative.
So it's the what's the old adage in spring when a young man thoughts of fancy turn to love or something.
Right.
There's an old English proverb that talks about springtime being when all of a sudden people get amorous, they get excited, they get loving, if you will, and therefore Song of Songs, which is a love poem, maybe fits that spring theme because of that.
The receiving the commandments was the equivalent of almost a wedding.
Well, the receiving the commandments was definitely Shavuot, but
Sorry.
in Jewish weddings there are 2 portions, right? There is the final step, the Shofar Brachot, where one is absolutely finally married, but then there is also a betrothal. And in the ancient world, the betrothal used to be a long ways away from the actual marriage. It was similar to what we do now with engagements, although done with much more seriousness than most modern engagements, which are easily broken unfortunately for many people. So in that measure, yes, the Exodus was very much our engagement to God. And then the arrival at Sinai and the reception of Torah, receiving of Torah, that's better. The receiving of Torah, that was more like the final step of our marriage to God. And indeed, that begins to explain how our tradition has read Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. Because when you read it through a traditional lens, it is not read as though it was a love poem. Or rather, it's not read as though it were an earthly love poem between boy and girl and boy. It is read instead as an extended metaphor for the love between God and the people of Israel. And its chapters are not interpreted just as the bodily and emotional pleasure of two people who are very fond of each other, but is instead, all those metaphors are interpreted to be metaphors for the bond between God and the people of Israel.
Is it clear that's what Solomon meant when he wrote it?
I mean, was there like a title page where he explained this?
Prologue.
Was there a prologue? Is that what you're saying? Was it like on the inside flap of the book when he got it from the library?
No, I mean, can you tell by the way it's written that that's what he meant?
Can who tell?
I'm gonna go with you.
Okay, well, so the question is, well, see, I am prejudiced because I have read it knowing that interpretation. And so that interpretation now seems very natural to me. For example, if you see those old optical illusions where someone draws a picture and is it a duck or is it a bunny? And depending upon the way you look at it, it looks like a duck. And if you look at it a different way, it looks like a bunny. Once someone tells you it's a duck or a bunny, you will be able to see both. But if they don't tell you, you will look at it and see only one thing. So I'm not the best example. Because I've been told, I've been trained, I've been indoctrinated, if you will, to see it as being more than just like one of Shakespeare's sonnets of love. So if you ask, would an objective reader of the Song of Songs, who simply sat down with no explanation at all, except this is what the words mean and this is what it's saying, would they come to the conclusion on their own, without any assistance, that this was an extended poetic metaphor of the loving relationship between God and the people of Israel?
No,
I would probably say no. In fact, let me give you a bit of an example.
no, because I've read it and I didn't come to that.
Well, we're going to back up then of how we get.
The intent of the writing, though.
Well, but the intent of the writing only reaches the reader if the writer has written it in a way that the intent is clear to the reader. Right. So, I mean, I can write a note that I intend to be sarcastic or mean, but if I don't do it right, the reader won't know that I meant to be sarcastic and mean. The same way I can write something that I intend to be funny, and the person might think it was sarcastic and mean because I didn't convey the humor in my text the way I wanted. And that's the challenge of writing, is that how well you convey your intention is very much dependent upon the writer, even more than the reader. So we can argue, well, a sophisticated reader, blah, 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 but I'd be willing to argue that no reader left to their own devices, no matter how sophisticated, if they found this section of poetry by itself, not in the Bible, would come to the conclusion that this was meant to be a religiously themed poem.
But it was meant for a certain group of people, so it wasn't meant to be.
But we don't know that yet. Hold on, let me give you the opening lines. Right? The Song of Songs by Solomon. Oh, give me of the kisses of your mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Your ointment yields a sweet fragrance. Your name is like finest oil. Therefore do maidens love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me to his chambers. Let us delight and rejoice in your love, savoring it more than wine. Like new wine, they love you. I am dark but comely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the pavilions of Solomon. Don't stare at me because I am swarthy, because the sun has gazed upon me. My mother's sons quarreled with me. They made me guard the vineyards. My own vineyard I did not guard. Tell me, you whom I love so well, where do you pasture your sheep? Where do you rest them at noon? Let me not be as one who strays beside the flocks of your fellows. So, obviously about God, right?
Well, a question.
Sure.
One of the commentaries I read said this was first performed at the dedication of the temple.
Sure, why not?
That's
Why not?
It doesn't say it was.
but that's one of the commentaries said that this probably was probably performed when the temple was first dedicated, and this was Solomon's contribution, part of his contribution towards the ceremony.
Apart from paying for the thing.
Right.
It's an interesting theory, right? And this is going to lead us back into the question of, well, how did this get into the Bible? Because we consider it sacred literature because of the company it keeps, right? Because we can look over on that side of the library and see in all the books of the Bible that there's a book titled Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. It is part of what we call the canon. It is part of the Tanakh. It is in Ketuvim. It is in the writings. Therefore, we are forced to try and understand it through the lens of our spirituality and our faith, that there is something deeply religious about this, and not just what it appears to be on the surface. Now, that makes perfect sense when you realize that other parts of the Bible as well probably also call out for interpretation and demand that we look for meaning that is beyond the level of surface. You know, when Isaiah is talking about various wild and domestic animals getting together and having a picnic where one doesn't end up dead, he's not talking about how animals eat. He's talking about the powerful and the weak coming together and not preying upon each other. Well, upon each other. The powerful preying upon the weak. It usually goes in that direction. You don't get an awful lot of sheep eating the wolves. And that forces us, because it's in Isaiah, to contextualize it through his vision of redemption. And we realize he's not just talking about animal husbandry. When we talk about God being a shepherd, so too, it's obvious that we are meant to interpret this in some way other than saying God has a bunch of sheep on the back hill. But Song of Songs is not contextualized. It is a book of the Bible by itself. It is plonked, if you will, in the midst of other texts that are overtly religious, but in and of itself only has an air of religiosity because of the company it keeps. And the question then is, well, how did it get into that company, which has lended it to this, which has, we can say, then allowed us to uncover its spiritual insights that would have remained completely hidden if it had not been put into this collection. Does that make sense? All right, we take for granted that there must be something religious going on here because it's in a religious book. But it didn't get into the religious book because it was so obviously religious, like the book of Leviticus, that who would have left it out? And so that's what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to take just a little stab at some of those opening lines to see what religious teachings we can gain from this supposed erotic literature. And I should point out that it is very worthwhile at some point to go through Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, and to actually read it as also a love poem between man and woman, and to interpret the metaphors that way as well. What's that? Did I run out?
I'm sorry.
Is someone hoarding them?
I'm hoarding.
I'm good.
That's okay. We're just going to do the commentaries. Like I said, it definitely though behooves you to go back and read all of Shir HaShirim during this week of Pesach, both with an eye to its plain meaning as well as an eye to its deeper spiritual meaning. And if I'm not mistaken, David, you brought in a copy of the Art Scroll Tanakh, and if I'm not mistaken, the way Art Scroll translates Shir HaShirim, at least in the copy that I have at home, is significantly different than what I just read, because the Art Scroll translation is the interpretation of the extended metaphor of the love between God and Israel. You have to look in their footnotes to get the actual translation of the Hebrew text without that layer of interpretation. Art Scroll believes that. Right. JPS should be similar to what I just read, but Art Scroll interprets it for you from the start, and you have to dig to find the actual translation, because they feel that the interpretation of it as get a little warm in here, as a love song between God and Israel is the true meaning of the text, and that any other meaning of it is simply the veil that you have to push aside. Good? All right, so let's talk a little bit about canonization. how do books become holy? That may sound like a silly question, right? We got a big holy book in the Ark over there, a couple copies of it, in fact. And the Torah is holy because,
God.
okay, so we can say, now the Torah is the only thing that we can actually have some form of self-referential explanation that God gave us the Torah. Right? God gave us the commandments. This is the record of the commandments. Therefore, this is a holy book. Simple. Good. Book of Joshua. Why is that holy?
Because the ancient rabbis said what?
Well, okay, but
They got together.
They got together, they had a meeting.
self-referentially, there's nothing in the book of Joshua that says this is also holy like the books of the Torah. The book of Isaiah, there's nothing that says this is holy like the other books. The book of Daniel, the book of Psalms, they do not in themselves make claims about their own holiness.
But they were inspired by God, by divine revelation.
That's,
So in certain prophetic works, you will have conversations between the prophet and God, and those will then be considered to be, yes, divine prophecy. The thing is, those aren't the only books from those time periods that made those claims.
well,
If you go back, especially to the time period where we have things like the book of Enoch and the book of Adam and all sorts of other books that are non-canonical, that are not part of the Bible, they make claims too, that God has been talking to them and that they're seeing angels and that they are speaking on behalf of divinity. And Judaism said, well, that's all very nice and well, but you're not part of the Tanakh. You're not in the Bible.
you didn't make the cut. So they all got together and they had to look at all of these texts and they had to put some kind of order together.
Right, so traditionally, by academic standards, there is a theory that basically you had, these are books, a whole bunch of books,
Scroll.
right?
Yeah.
They were scrolls,
They
thank
were
you. That's
scrolls,
that's
they-
not just because writing squares is harder, right? And then you had a committee.
Or
Committee
assembly.
project.
Those are people, right? You had a committee, and the committee said, those are holy. Those are not.
Right.
Right? There's a theory that was the way the canonization happened. That theory is wrong. Right? That theory is wrong. There's also the sort of classic misunderstanding of the rabbinic theory, which is the misunderstanding is also wrong. The classic understanding of the rabbinic theory is that the rabbis received all the holy books already stamped holy by somebody before them, and therefore there was no question about what was holy and what wasn't, because every book that was holy came pre-stamped as holy with some sort of, hashgacha, some sort of hechsher on it that came from some other third-party source out of heaven, we don't know, that removed all doubt of what was considered to be a holy book and what was not considered to be a holy book. That is also wrong. And that's also not what the rabbis claim, but it's how people often will interpret what they think the rabbis, the sages of old did when they were talking about canonization. So let's look at what the rabbis actually do say about the canonization project. Now, to understand this portion that we're going to begin with the all holy scriptures defile the hands as our opening line, is to understand that when we talk about holy scriptures defiling the hands, the rabbis enacted a precaution against the misuse of holy texts, that when you touch them, your hands would become ritually impure. Right? So you touch the actual scroll of the Torah, you touch the scroll of the Megillah, your hands become ritually impure. And that means before you could eat anything, you would have to do netilat yadayim, you would have to wash your hands ritually in order to remove that ritual impurity. Now you're probably thinking, because we're good modern Western civilization people, how can something holy render the hands impure? Well, first of all, impurity is not bad in like that, dirty, naughty sense. Impurity simply means that you need to purify before you do things that are meant to be done while pure. Additionally, this was a precautionary measure because the rabbis were very concerned that people would be using these books while having their sandwiches, that they'd be eating while studying. Now, we might think, well, great, at least they're studying. But anybody here who grew up going to the library knows that librarians don't like you eating while handling the books. And that's when you have a printing press. Imagine what it is like when you don't have a printing press, right? When everything is hand done. And imagine what it's like when you are surrounded by vermin, you know, rats, mice, weasels, all sorts of other things. And you are now leaving food near your scrolls, which are made out of sometimes papyrus, but more often for the good ones are made out of animal skin. You're just packing the pantry so that the rats can come through and eat everything. Unfortunately, simply telling people don't eat with the books didn't work, which is why I still eat when I'm reading my own books, novels and things. And so the rabbis had to be more extreme, and they relied upon people's squeamishness regarding ritual purity, even if they were not willing to listen to their other edicts, and said, if you eat while you're reading, without having done netilat yadayim in between, you are eating food now that you have rendered ritually impure. And that worked. That was able to put a barrier between the person and the text and the food, and things worked well. But to come back to our section of canonization, when the rabbis talk about canonization, they will often talk about it as which books make the hands impure and which books don't. And the books that make the hands impure, those are the holy books, right? So if you want to read a book of Euclid or Plato, your hands are not going to get ritually impure, and you can do that while having your sandwich. Not this time of year, but you can do that while having your food. But if you want to read a book of the Tanakh, then you need to have that separation because of the ritual purity question. That means ritual impurity equals in the canon equals being a holy book. Good introduction?
Yeah.
Okay, I need a volunteer. Please.
All holy scriptures defile the hands.
Which is what I basically just said in short version.
Shir HaShirim and Ecclesiastes defile the hands, Rabbi Judah says. Rabbi Judah says, Shir HaShirim defiles the hands, but there is a dispute regarding Ecclesiastes.
Right, remember, Ecclesiastes is also known as Kohelet.
Rabbi
Yosei.
Ecclesiastes does not defile the hands, and there is a dispute about Shir HaShirim.
All right, so notice that we've got a couple of suspect entries into the canon, right? There's a debate about which one is more suspect, but both the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, and the book of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, are considered to be iffy in the eyes of at least some of the sages during the latter half of the Second Temple period. We good? Right, so those are canonish. And they both say that there are disputes about them. Good? Good. Onward.
Rabbi Shimon says the status of Ecclesiastes is one of the lenient rulings of the school of Shammai and one of the strict rulings of the school of Hillel.
Meaning that even Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued about the book of Kohelet, about whether Ecclesiastes actually achieved canonical status or not. And for those of you who have read the book of Kohelet, why might it seem like it doesn't deserve canonical status? I mean, we've talked about Shir HaShirim, where it looks like it's just, a big love poem, and that doesn't seem exactly holy. But what's wrong with Kohelet? It's all full of life lessons and stuff.
It's kind of like influenced by Greek philosophy, and it's very negative.
We'll set the origins aside, but the negativity of it, in particular, the feeling that there is no difference between being good and being bad, between being wise and being stupid, because we're all just gonna die. That attitude seems awfully antithetical to the Torah, right? The Torah doesn't say, be good so that you'll live forever, right? The Torah says, choose life because this is the right thing to do. And there are parts of Kohelet that, in part, taken especially out of context from the whole, seem to say, meh, what difference does it make, right? Rich, poor, smart, stupid, righteous, wicked, we're all going to be dirt, right? So why bother? Eat, drink, be merry. There are parts that can be read in that way, and that made it suspect, at least, in the eyes of some, that it was truly inspired by God, who doesn't normally have that kind of attitude expressed in other books. But let's go ahead and see how they discuss it.
Rabbi Shimon ben Azai said, I have a tradition from the 72 elders of the Sanhedrin that on the day when Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was appointed head of the academy, it was decided that Shir HaShirim and Ecclesiastes defiled the hands.
Okay, so in this version, as you can see, different than our false rabbinic version, the rabbis are actually having a committee saying these books add. Now, it sounds like they are saying these ones were always considered holy, meaning everything else in the Bible, but Shir HaShirim and Kohelet, they had to wait until there was definitive agreement that they were all together, and that took till this very special and rather late moment in Jewish history.
Why is there 72 in the Sanhedrin instead of 71?
Because you have the president of the Sanhedrin.
Oh, I thought he was the 71st. No?
We'll talk about court construction another time. Well, it's a good question, but one that could derail us into another tangent. So the question here then is, were they just sitting around as being popular books until they finally got this official status or not? And Rabbi Akiva pipes up.
Rabbi Akiva said, God forbid, no one in Israel disputed about Shir HaShirim, saying that it does not defile the hands, for all of eternity in its entirety is not as worthy as the day on which Shir HaShirim was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but Shir HaShirim is the holy of holies.
All right, we're going to pause there before we get the rest of his comment. So Rabbi Akiva likes the poem or not?
Yeah, he's really cool.
So
Yes,
he not only likes the poem, he is basically saying that Shir HaShirim
is the best.
is not just the best in the sense that it was the most, elegant or literary, beauty, or is spiritually, right? It is in terms of sanctity considered greater than everything else put together, right? That all of eternity may have been good, like, that whole getting out of Egypt thing or all of that other stuff. But the day we got this book, that beats them all. That's what you want on the title, the cover jacket, when you're selling the book at Barnes & Noble, right? Rabbi Akiva, better than the rest of eternity. I mean, that is like a 5-star review, right? And it doesn't even sound like one of those fake Amazon reviews. That sounds legit, that this guy, who's got a lot of reputation behind him, really, 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 really liked this book. And he is trying to say it was always part, I just circled the wrong one. It was always part of the holy category. Right? There was never an argument about this, because who could ever possibly imagine that this was not a holy book? On the other hand, the last sentence.
And if they disputed at all, they disputed only regarding Ecclesiastes.
He's like saying, yeah, maybe there was an argument. I'm not 100% sure one way or the other, but if they were arguing, the only thing they could have been arguing about is Kohelet. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. That one, I could at least see why they would have been arguing about, but no one would have been arguing about Shir HaShirim. The last paragraph from the
Rabbi
section.
Yohanan
Mishnah?
Joshua said, the son of Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law said, as according to Ben Azai, so did they dispute, and so did they determine that both Shir HaShirim and Ecclesiastes are included in the canon.
All right, so he's still pushing back against Akiva to say, no, this was never an issue. These were both issues, both Shir HaShirim and Kohelet, but they also both were officially given the stamp of approval to come in. So what do we get from this idea of canonization? Well, what we get is an idea that there was what we can call a proto-canon, which is to say that there was a collection of books that was accepted by the nation more or less as being the holy books of the nation. And that proto-canon had existed and was added to over the centuries as new books were written. So when the book of Joshua was written, people accepted it. The nation accepted that as being the book of Joshua and part of the Tanakh. When the book of Judges was written, people accepted it as being holy and part of the canon. When the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, etc., when all of those were compiled from the different teachings or prophecies of those prophets, they were then accepted by the nation more or less. But there were some books, apparently, that were more on the less side than the more side, that were on the fringes of the proto-canon. So you can sort of imagine it as though, the Torah, everyone, absolutely, yes, we all know the Torah is the Torah. And then the prophets were basically considered to be also universally accepted within the nation. But notice that it wasn't because they came with magic flaming stamps on them. It was because the nation itself recognized the sanctity of these books. If you will, this is the Wikipedia version of canonization. By popular acclaim, these books were accepted within the canon and were considered to be sacred and important. If that makes you uncomfortable because we've stripped God out of it, simply realize that God is working through the history of the nation to make sure that certain books are preserved as canonical, and other books that were definitely written because we see references of them in the Tanakh were not considered canonical enough to be preserved for all time. Let me just give the one last ring. And then, of course, we have Ketuvim, the writings. And the Ketuvims, there was a bit more of a soft edge. And the book of Kohelet and the book of Shir HaShirim appear to have been on the edge of that soft edge. And there were probably some who said, yes, canonical, and some who said, no, not canonical. And eventually it was decided that they were. And then what they're arguing about in this Mishnah is maybe Kohelet was slightly more outside than Shir HaShirim, which was slightly more inside the popular acclaim. Okay, questions, comments?
Can you give, because in Deuteronomy, you have, oh, I found this in the back room. Okay.
No, you have an interpretation of the events of King Josiah's time.
Right. Which
that
is
there was
hundreds of years.
that there was something found. Now, it became very, very common in the middle of the 20th century to say that was the book of Deuteronomy. It never says that in the book of Kings. Right? It's a reasonable assumption because much of what is referred to in Josiah's reform does get mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. If there are other authors, including traditional commentators, who say, no, they found the whole Torah itself, right? That it wasn't just the book of Deuteronomy, it was the whole Torah. The people who came up with the Deuteronomy theory of that were mostly people who were arguing for multiple authorships of the Torah, to say that it wasn't found under King Josiah, that he had it written, that he had it constructed, which of course kind of hits at the integrity of the text.
So for a period of time, we were following the Torah, which I'm trying to do this kind of in a timeline.
Right. No, for a period of time, the people were not good Jews. For most of the time after the death of Joshua, with small intermissions with good judges and small intermissions with people like Samuel and David, for most of our time during what we would call the First Temple period, from the settlement of Israel through the destruction, we weren't very good. And in fact, much of the Torah was not common knowledge among most of the people. However, among the people who cared, this was the canon that was accepted. And that idea of the canon as being what was accepted by the people who had an interest in what was considered canonical is very similar to something that was put forward by Rabbi Solomon Schechter, Zichrono Livracha, the great sage of the conservative movement, who often talked about, and this is going to sound weird, Catholic Israel. He doesn't mean Catholic like the particular Christian denomination Catholic. He means Catholic in the sense of what the word Catholic means when it's a lowercase c, not an uppercase c, which is to simply mean the collective body of those who are committed to a particular organization, ideal, or religion. And so that's why Catholicism is called Catholicism, but it's a perfectly fine English word, all on its own without any other association with a particular religion. And so his argument was that Judaism and the canon was carried by Catholic Israel, by the committed members of the people of Israel, and they had strong opinions about what was and what wasn't part of the canon. And those strong opinions were able to survive all of the turmoil around them. And when we were back and we had the Reformation under Ezra to put together a new country that would not make the same mistakes that the old group had, it became clearer and more widely disseminated which books we should be reading and following based on what had been preserved during this proto-canon time. But certain books like Kohelet and Shir HaShirim still were on the edge of which books get copied the most. That's another interesting thing you can look up on your own time, but there are interesting analyses of how many fragments of different texts we have found in different parts of the classical world, specifically at the Qumran site, of which books did they copy the most of, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and such, to see which books were most popular among the people at the time. And there definitely seems to have been rankings of which books people really, really, really liked and they always referred to, and which books they didn't. And similar studies have also been done for rabbinic literature, of where do they quote from, to get a sense of which books they really liked and which books they, we read it, but not a whole lot. Interesting study, more academic than we need to get into today. Okay, with that in mind, let's see then how the rabbis then consider this Shir HaShirim in its spiritual canonical sense. All right, so that's enough little history analysis. Let's get into content. So, next paragraph, please.
He who recites a verse of the Shir HaShirim and turns it into a kind of love song, and he who recites a verse in a banquet hall, not at the proper time, but in a time of carousal, brings evil into the world. For the Torah puts on sackcloth and stands before the Holy One, blessed be he, and says before him, Lord of the world, your children have treated me like a harp, which scoffers play.
All right, so the canonical status means also that the abuse of the text becomes problematic, right? So once it becomes canonical, you can't play this at your wedding reception anymore. Now, you can use quotes of it during the procession, you can use quotes of it during the ceremony, but if you have people dancing around to this like this is some latest pop hit, which the lyrics could lend themselves to thinking that's what it should be, then you are not understanding what it means to be canonical, right? Because God, now that we've said this is canonical, we can say God would not have given us this text just to tell us that physical love between boy and girl is something that people enjoy. That God did not need all of Shir HaShirim to share that brilliant insight with us. So we kind of got that already. So therefore, to treat it as though that's all it's doing would be the equivalent of to take other beautiful, either natural or human verses from other parts of the Bible that talk about wonderful things in the world, and to turn them into trite pop songs. That would also be inappropriate. Make sense? We see how once it becomes canonical, certain uses, not just regarding your hands, but certain other uses go off limits. Good. Onward.
Rabbi Hiyah taught that only in his elder years did the Holy Spirit reside in Shlomo, enabling him to write the three works of Mishlei, Kohelet, and Shir HaShirim,
which are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. So Rabbi Hiyah taught that this happened all at once, or more or less all at once, that when he got a certain level of wisdom, then he could write these three. But Rabbi Yonatan disagrees.
Rabbi Yonatan maintains that Shlomo wrote Shir HaShirim first, and then Mishlei, and then Kohelet.
Right, so Song of Songs, Proverbs, and then Ecclesiastes.
And he brought proof from the way of the world. The young sing, middle-aged people tell parables, and the elderly see the vanities of the world.
Oh, ain't that the truth? Okay, but what does Rabbi Yonatan's interpretation tell us about the author's intent of Shir HaShirim?
But that's where the freshness that's associated with Pesach. You know, when deliverance is new, things are fresh. Things you're finally free.
Or you could say,
there's a sense of joy.
But you could say that Solomon wrote this when he was young, because that's the kind of songs that young guys write. Right? It's this guy on the edge of his bed playing his guitar to try and impress a girl, and he's writing this because that's the way young people are.
But there's the enthusiasm there.
Of course there's enthusiasm. Have you ever seen a young guy in love?
Right.
There's plenty of enthusiasm there.
He had a lot of love for it, let me tell you.
Well, as he got older, he had a little too much love.
He had too much love.
That became a problem. But there is another way to interpret this, which is to say, at different stages in Solomon's life, his connection to God expressed itself through the medium of his current age. Right? So when he was young, as he connects to God, of course he's going to see this as being this massive pageantry of love between Israel and God, and so it takes form in Shir HaShirim. And then as he is middle-aged, he sees this massive love between Israel and God as being the gift of wisdom. And then when he is old, he sees this massive love between God and Israel as being understanding that so much of the world that we focus on and struggle over is really not important. But there still are important things. You just have to look harder for them than it seemed like when he was 21 and writing Shir HaShirim. He's not actually 21 when he wrote Shir HaShirim. We don't know how old he was.
So things have to do with maturity and seeing the world as you grow.
But the relationship and the message are the same, but how he expresses it is wrapped in his own personal experiences. And as his experiences change, as his growth change, how he's going to express that truth, that continues to change. Which is why reading Shir HaShirim doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reject the youthful exuberance of romance, and also that we shouldn't think that this whole veneer of, well, it's really just about God and Israel is an add-on. It is absolutely appropriate to believe that this is an extended poem of the love between God and Israel, written in a vehicle, written in a form that would have spoken most powerfully to a very young author when it was being composed. Make sense? Maybe? All right, well, let's take a look.
With that thinking, then, couldn't you say that'd be a good validation of canonization anyway?
Oh, of course, right?
Plus the sidebar rule of three.
Which is always handy.
It's always handy, right?
Yeah.
You got it.
Okay, so let's take a look at some of the content, or at least how parts of the Shir HaShirim, just the beginning phrases that I recited for you, are discussed in the eyes of many of the later commentaries, if you don't mind.
In our opening midrash, Rabbi Meir takes the view that wine, because it causes confusion of the mind, is unwholesome.
Which, if you remember from when I recited the first few lines, wine figures prominently as a positive metaphor in that relationship, right? You're better than wine is considered to be a compliment, not an insult. Keep going.
Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, holds that far from confusing the mind, wine confers blessings on those who drink it. It improves the digestion, temperament, etc., when consumed in moderation.
That moderation word is important.
Yeah.
The Bible is full of quotations attesting to the virtues of wine.
Right.
As the wine cellar was open to all who wished to buy, so Sinai was open to all who wished to learn Torah, to help them control the urge to let the demand of flesh dominate, a tendency that has existed since the first sin in Eden. This is why the Talmud claims that the Israelites who stood at Mount Sinai divested themselves of the impurities ingested by man in Eden due to the serpent.
Right, so the Talmud is basically saying that all of the burden that we had carried of the confusion of which way to live, which path to choose, that had come from leaving Eden back in the day, all of that was clarified for us, right? We no longer had a confusion about which way to live, about what was good and what was bad, because Torah lays it out for us, and that happened at Mount Sinai. Make sense? And just as the wine cellar is always open, so too is Torah, which again is a bit of a backhanded compliment to wine, in the sense that you can always go drink yourself into stupidness, or you can go get some Torah. Both are available whenever you need it. But he's going to go on a little bit more to try and clarify what this means, though.
For this reason, too, our sages say that all of Israel has a share in the world to come. If the Talmud had meant that every Jew, whether religious or secular, has eternal life, that would be unfair discrimination against the Gentiles and would make the life of the pious Jew unrewarding.
Important caveat, the word secular doesn't mean the same thing it means in the modern sense. Secular here means sinner, somebody who absolutely disregards Judaism and doesn't follow any of its ways, not just somebody who happens to wear modern style clothing or read modern style books in addition to keeping a good Jewish life.
The sinner could then look forward to the same destiny.
All right, and basically saying that for this idea to work, it has to be that about the idea that the wine that we are receiving is the choice that we have, and if you choose to follow Torah, then you have share in the world to come. If you choose not to, then you don't, because otherwise that's not fair to all the other people of the world. You can't just say that if you're Jewish, you can coast to the world to come without having to live a good life. It's instead has to be saying that you can get to the next world to come because the Torah has now shown you the right way to walk. Make sense?
Yeah.
A little bit? All right, all of that from just a little bit of wine, which, we just had 4 cups of recently, or 8 cups if you count the 2 days together. So it's appropriate that we're still talking about it. But there's another wonderful theme, which is that of water, of mayim.
Yeah.
So we're moving now to Sifrei. Sifrei is one of our earlier collections of midrashim.
Words of Torah are compared to water. Just as water is life for the world, so words of Torah, as it is written, for they are life to those who find them, and healing to all of his flesh. And just as water raises a man from his uncleanliness, so too words of Torah raise a man from uncleanliness to cleanliness. As it is written in Psalms, the fear of the Lord is pure. And just as water restores a man's soul, so words of Torah restore a man's soul from the path of evil to that of good. The Torah of the Lord is whole, restoring the soul. And just as water is free for the world, so the words of Torah are free for the world, as in Isaiah 55, Ho, all who thirst, go to the waters, or come now to the waters. And I have a question about that.
Okay, just a second. So I want to make sure we understand the metaphor that's happening here. Is what the Midrash has basically said is that when you see the word water, you should be thinking Torah. And then when you think about water and what it does, whatever water does, Torah does too. This is an example, not written out in full poetic form, of exactly why we can read Shir HaShirim legitimately as being a poem about God and Israel, rather than a poem about man and woman. Because once you accept that the concept of one thing can help you understand a different concept, then you can see how that extended poem can help you understand something about Israel and God, not just about man and woman. Does that make sense? We accept this all the time on a small scale. Where people resist it when we talk about Shir HaShirim is the idea that this is what's happening on the macro scale throughout the entire book. That if the entire book is metaphorical seems to ruffle a lot of feathers. But once you realize that, no, we're always accepting that something that we can contemplate one idea and then learn something about a different concept, that's called thinking. Then why not put that into a poem that would be more engaging than just writing a philosophical treatise, which no one would ever read.
Or that there's spiritual realities that have to use worldly language because we don't have the language for these spiritual realities.
Partly we lack the language, and also we would lack the audience, which is a very real concern, right? The most beautiful spiritual and insightful books that sit on the shelf and are never read are worthless to humanity. But a book like Shir HaShirim that still excites and gets people engaged, and then they can begin to learn from it, that's a lot more useful. That is a lot more useful.
This might be a little off topic, but the majority of Solomon's books are missing, right?
Well, we don't know how many books he wrote. We know that he was considered exceptionally wise. We know that wisdom literature was a common genre of the ancient world. So we would expect that he wrote more. But yes, we don't have those books. But we don't have a list of his missing books.
There's a tradition that he wrote like 1,000 books or something.
That's 1,000 Psalms. That's in I forget which text. It says Solomon wrote over 1,000 Psalms.
Right, but that's a tradition. We don't actually have from his own works or from the books like the Book of Kings about him or Chronicles that say that he definitely did write X number. Good? Okay. But there's a problem with using metaphors, and that's where what happens when we get metaphorical overreach.
But perhaps, just as water has no value, so Torah has no value.
Right? So that's the problem with metaphors. Right? As soon as you start talking metaphorically, then maybe you're going to stretch the analogy and you hit a wall. And so, all right, Torah's like water, but wait a minute, water is worthless. So does that mean Torah is worthless? And the answer is?
Well, it depends. Water is not worthless in the desert. It's priceless.
It is, but for most of the time in the communities where this was being discussed, water was the one thing that people weren't charging for. And it's the one thing you couldn't sell.
Don't get me started.
Yeah,
We have a bottle of water today. That's as far as I want to go with that, okay, just for the.
That's why I said in their communities, in their time.
Okay,
Yes.
that's right, that's the context.
In our time, people can sell ice to the Eskimos. So,
I was gonna ask about the comment from the line from Isaiah,
oh, yes.
there is one part of the Talmud, the question is, why does Isaiah write at one point, ho all the thirty, go to the waters, and another point he writes, carry water to the parched?
Mhm.
And the answer is because some people have their faith so low, you have to go up to them.
Right, to reach out to
You
them, to
have to
extend,
reach out
yeah.
to those who have such a little faith. They're like those who are parched in the desert. They have
And they don't even know where to go.
They don't know where to go. So,
Right.
that was-
Okay,
that was that. Moving
But
on.
tell me more about this valueless Torah.
It is therefore written in Proverbs, it is more precious than pearls, and all of your desires cannot be compared to it.
All right, so don't worry, Torah is not valueless like water, because we know from Proverbs that it is exceptionally valuable. And then continue.
But perhaps just as water does not rejoice the heart of one who has drunk it, so too the words of Torah do not rejoice the heart.
Right? It's you can all probably associate with this that when someone has a glass of water, it is a very different feeling than when you have a glass of wine.
It is therefore written, for your love is better than wine. Song of Songs 1.2.
Was one of our opening phrases from Shir HaShirim. So now we know that your love, notice this particular author capitalized the Y, which doesn't get capitalized in Hebrew because Hebrew doesn't have capital letters, is trying to remind us that that interpretation is built around the notion that this is a relationship between God and Israel. And that's why your love, God, is better than wine. And how do we know, how do we equate God's love to us? With the gift of Torah, which every day when we do Ahava Rabbah and Ahavat Olam in our prayers, reminds us that God loves us through the gift of Torah. Onward.
Just as wine rejoices, so words of Torah rejoice, as it is written in Psalms 18. The statutes of the Lord are just, rejoicing the heart.
All right, and notice what we've done, right? We said water is equal to Torah, and then we said Torah is like wine when it comes to the pleasure of it, a rejoicing of the heart. But now we're eventually also going to extend this metaphor to the point where it needs to be corrected as well.
And just as with wine, you taste the flavor of wine from the beginning. But the more it ages in the bottle, the more its flavor is enhanced. So, words of Torah, the older they grow in the body, the more their flavor is enhanced. As it says in the book of Job, with the aged there is wisdom, and with length of days, understanding. And just as wine is not preserved in vessels of gold or in vessels of silver, but in the basest of vessels, those of clay, so words of Torah are preserved only in one who lowers himself.
This metaphor, by the way, in the last section there, the idea about what you put your wine into, was a classic proverb, not just in the Jewish world, but throughout the ancient world. Because people noticed, quite astutely, that if you were rich, you always wanted to have the best of everything. And so you would have the fanciest gold this and the fanciest silver that and all. But when it came to wine, if you had a giant gold pitcher and you put the wine into it and left it there to, stay, it ruins the wine, right? You don't leave wine in metal containers. That's why you don't have, soda cans of wine. And the idea then was that there was some lesson to be learned there, and which our tradition took to mean that Torah, just like wine, should be stored in a humble vessel, meaning you should be a humble person, not aggrandizing yourself and being all flashy and full of bling, because that will spoil your Torah the same way gold and silver would spoil the wine. Metaphor works?
So wine in a box.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, glass eventually turned out to be
Yeah.
the ideal container.
Wine in a box is not a good idea.
Might have a tendency of breathing a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
But that's what a cork in a bottle does the same thing.
Yeah.
That's why you use cork for aging wine, because it has to have a little bit.
Just a little. Okay, but now we've got ourselves into a corner where we've extended the idea that Torah is now like wine, but wine also has problems to go with it. So let's back out of that.
But perhaps, just as wine is sometimes bad for the head and for the body, so words of Torah. It is therefore written, for fragrance your oils are good, poured forth oil is your name. Just as oil is good for the head and good for the body, so too words of Torah, as it is written in Proverbs, it is healing for your navel and marrow for your bones. And it will give your head an adornment of grace, a crown of glory will it accord you. Words of Torah are compared to oil and honey, and they are sweeter than honey and the honeycomb.
Okay. Which leaves us with the idea that Torah has all of the benefits of wine and all of the benefits of water and none of the drawbacks. And we've got verses to prove it. And the metaphors that are extended throughout this wine or water line should remind us then that the metaphors extended throughout Shir HaShirim, while maybe looking like they are only about romantic love, are also very good vehicles for teaching us about a relationship with God. A relationship that during this counting of the Omer, between the beginning of Passover and the celebration of Shavuot, that we should be thinking about exactly how are we tending to this relationship as we move towards the chuppah, as we move towards the final stage of our marriage to God. How are we doing at maintaining this relationship? Read Shir HaShirim and see whether you are experiencing the kind of love that is being described there, because that is the ultimate goal that we should have for our relationship. Take care and Moadim L'Simcha.
Thank you.